Inside a sealed wooden briefing hut in East Prussia, a single bomb ticks beneath a polished oak table, and 10 seconds decide the fate of a continent. This is the story of the German officers who dared to kill Hitler, and how one twist of chance shattered the last hope to stop the war. By the winter of 1943, the German Reich no longer looked invincible. What had once been presented as a 1,000-year empire now trembled under the weight of its own ambition. The ashes of Stalingrad still hung over the nation's conscience. Entire armies had vanished on the Eastern Front. Cities burned under Allied bombing raids. And inside the Wehrmacht's high command, a quiet but growing certainty began to take shape. Germany was heading towards self-destruction, and one man stood at the center of it. Adolf Hitler's authority had metastasized into something absolute and unpredictable. From his headquarters in East Prussia, he issued orders increasingly detached from reality, commands to hold positions to the last man, to counterattack where no reserves existed, to sacrifice divisions already bled white. Generals who questioned him were dismissed, humiliated, or placed under surveillance. Even senior officers with decades of loyal service felt the tightening grip of fear. And yet, in that climate of paranoia, a resistance was forming, not born from political ideology, but from a moral and strategic reckoning. Among the first to see the abyss clearly was Colonel Henning von Tresckow, a brilliant staff officer on Army Group Center. He had witnessed the Eastern Front firsthand, the massacres committed by SS Einsatzgruppen, the starvation policies, the burning of villages, and the impossible orders that condemned thousands of German soldiers to die in frozen trenches. To Tresckow, the war was no longer a military catastrophe. It had become a moral one. A German victory, he told an aide, is no longer possible, but a German crime is. Working quietly beside him were men who understood what was coming. General Ludwig Beck, the former chief of the General Staff, had resigned years earlier in protest against Hitler's reckless militarization. He now became the intellectual architect of a future Germany, a nation rebuilt from the ruins of dictatorship. General Friedrich Albrecht, operating from the Bendler Block in Berlin, wove resistance plans into the Wehrmacht's own mobilization system. And Karl Gordeler, the former mayor of Leipzig, provided the political vision of a provisional government that might save the country from total annihilation. But it was the arrival of Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg that changed everything. A decorated officer, severely wounded in North Africa, he had returned from the battlefield both physically scarred and spiritually transformed. Shocked by the regime's brutality and convinced that Hitler was destroying Germany, Stauffenberg brought to the conspiracy something it desperately needed: urgency, charisma, and the courage to act. Together, these men formed the core of what would become the most determined attempt to overthrow Hitler from within the German military. Yet every step they took was overshadowed by the Gestapo's watchful eyes, by informants, by the fear that a single careless word could mean execution. Still, the conspirators understood that time was running out. The Red Army was pushing west. Allied bombers owned the skies. Germany's defeat seemed inevitable, but the question was whether the nation could be saved from complete ruin. One night, inside a dimly lit staff office on the Eastern Front, Tresckow leaned close to a trusted confidant. His voice was calm, but heavy with finality. The man must be removed, or Germany will cease to exist. The die had been cast. By 1943, the German resistance had ceased to be a loose collection of disillusioned officers. It was becoming a coordinated network, fragile, compartmentalized, and constantly in danger, but a network nonetheless. Inside a dictatorship where a careless phrase could mean death, a group of aristocrats, generals, civil servants, and military staff officers began building a conspiracy directly beneath Hitler's gaze. They called themselves simply the Men of July 20th. Its roots stretched back years. As early as 1938, General Ludwig Beck had warned senior officers that Hitler's path would lead to national ruin. But after the catastrophic defeats at Stalingrad and later Kursk, resistance hardened into something more urgent. Germany was no longer losing slowly, it was collapsing. Millions were dead, the Eastern Front was bleeding armies dry, and Allied bombers were reducing cities to rubble. Yet the tipping point for many conspirators was not strategic. It was moral. Reports of massacres in Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, many carried out by SS units operating behind their own lines, moved officers like Henning von Treschow, Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf, and Fabian von Schlabrendorf to conclude that silence now meant complicity. The July plot took shape inside the very nerve center of the military machine, the Bendler Block in Berlin. Offices that outwardly processed mobilization orders were, in secret, drafting plans for a coup. Teleprinters that delivered directives to Wehrmacht district commanders were used, in carefully coded language, to map out the structure of a provisional government. Meetings disguised as routine staff discussions became whispered briefings on how to seize radio stations, SS headquarters, and key ministries. Every interaction was a risk. The walls of the OKW, the high command of the armed forces, were known to echo with informants and loyalists. Doors were left slightly ajar to catch unwanted listeners. Files were memorized instead of written. Letters were composed in invisible ink or delivered through trusted couriers because ordinary mail passed through hands loyal to the regime. The conspirators' greatest weapon was not force, it was secrecy. Their greatest fear was not failure, it was discovery. Then, in 1943, everything changed. A young, determined colonel named Claus von Stauffenberg returned from North Africa, grievously wounded after an air attack near Sidi Bou Zid. He had lost his right hand, 2 fingers on his left, and his left eye, but not his resolve. The experience sharpened his disgust with Hitler's leadership and accelerated his transformation from critic to operative. By the time he recovered, Stauffenberg was no longer simply a thinker. He was ready to act. His new assignment gave him what the resistance had never possessed: direct access to Hitler. As Chief of Staff to General Friedrich Fromm in the Reserve Army, Stauffenberg was now required to attend high-level briefings at the Führer's headquarters, first at the Wolfschanz in East Prussia and later at the Berghof. Only a handful of officers in Germany ever stood within arm's reach of Hitler. Stauffenberg was one of them. In conference rooms thick with cigarette smoke, surrounded by SS guards and senior Nazi officials, the conspirators saw their opportunity. They no longer had to smuggle explosives into remote depots or place bombs aboard aircraft. The man they needed, the only man who could trigger the coup, now walked into Hitler's presence carrying his dispatch case. The resistance understood the gravity of this shift. Across dimly lit offices in Berlin and field headquarters on the Eastern Front, the whispered conclusion spread. Only a man with access to Hitler can kill him, and Stauffenberg now holds that access. Hidden in the dense forests of East Prussia stood one of the most secretive and heavily fortified locations in Europe, the Wolfschanz, the Wolf's Lair. From the air, it looked like nothing more than endless pine canopy. But beneath the trees lay a vast military citadel. 80 buildings of reinforced concrete, steel blast doors, camouflaged barracks, minefields, anti-aircraft batteries, and SS patrols moving in silent, rehearsed patterns. It was here, inside Hitler's armored sanctuary, that the fate of the July plot would be decided. Security was absolute. Any visitor passed through layers of checkpoints manned by the Führerbeglied Commando, Hitler's personal guard, followed by strict body searches, identification checks, and continuous surveillance. Phones were monitored, conversations overheard, and every arrival catalogued with meticulous precision. Even senior officers felt the oppressive atmosphere, a sense that the forest itself was listening. Hitler's days followed routines carved into stone. Morning situational briefings, midday conferences with field commanders, and long, drifting monologues about the war's direction. The conspirators knew the schedule down to the minute. They knew where he stood, where he sat, even the angle of sunlight that filtered through the briefing hut. But routines alone were not enough. To kill Hitler here required something far more precise and far more dangerous. The weapon chosen for the task was deceptively small. Blocks of British-made plastic explosive, smuggled into Germany through military intelligence channels. The detonating system relied on pencil fuses, timed by a simple chemical reaction that gradually ate through a thin copper wire before releasing a firing pin. It was reliable, compact, and deadly, but arming it required pressure and dexterity, a task that would test even a fully able officer. Claus von Stauffenberg had only one functioning hand, yet he practiced relentlessly. In quiet offices, behind locked doors, he rehearsed the steps, break the glass vial inside the fuse, compress the charge, fold the explosive into his dispatch case, and make it appear routine. Each attempt was a race against time and his own damaged body. What others could arm in seconds took Stauffenberg minutes. Minutes he would never have inside the wolf's lair. But before Stauffenberg ever stepped into Hitler's presence with a live explosive, others had tried. In March 1943, Henning von Tresckow executed one of the boldest plots of the war. He placed a bomb disguised as a gift, 2 bottles of Cointreau, aboard Hitler's aircraft during a visit to Army Group Center. The device was armed. The fuse was functioning, but high-altitude cold froze the detonator, preventing detonation. The bottles were retrieved before the SS ever discovered the truth. That failure weighed heavily on the conspirators. Every delay meant more lives lost on the Eastern Front, more villages burned, more soldiers encircled in hopeless battles. As spring turned to summer in 1944, the Red Army prepared for Operation Bagration, a massive offensive that would obliterate Army Group Center. Time was no longer measured in weeks or months, but in the number of divisions being annihilated each day. Inside Berlin, tension became suffocating. Tresckow, Beck, Albrecht, Gordeler, all knew the window was closing. The wolf's lair was nearly impenetrable. The plan was almost impossible, but history rarely waits for ideal conditions. Then, on a warm July morning, a new directive arrived from headquarters. Stauffenberg was ordered to deliver a personal briefing to Hitler at the Wolfschanz on July 20, 1944. His moment had arrived. The morning of July 20, 1944, broke over East Prussia with an unremarkable stillness, the kind that belied the storm about to unfold. Pine trees along the access roads to the Wolfschanz swayed in a faint breeze, their shadows stretching across dirt and gravel, hiding the labyrinth of bunkers and barbed wire. Claus von Stauffenberg, carrying the most dangerous cargo in modern European history, boarded his light aircraft at Rassenberg Airfield. 2 bombs, encased in British plastic explosive and fitted with pencil detonators, rested in his briefcase. He could arm only one in time. The other remained a haunting, ticking potential for disaster. Every second counted. Security was as tight as ever. Every soldier on the perimeter, every SS sentry along the guarded corridors, was trained to detect the unusual. A single misstep would not only cost Stauffenberg his life but would doom the entire conspiracy. Yet he moved with practiced precision, walking past guards, climbing the small flight of stairs into the plane, and settling into the co-pilot's seat. The hum of the engine masked the thrum of fear in his chest. Across the cockpit, the tiny explosive in his hand seemed almost too small to contain the magnitude of what it represented. The potential end of Hitler, and with it, the fate of the Reich. By mid-morning, the plane touched down on the hidden airstrip inside the Wolfschanz. Guards saluted automatically, oblivious to the lethal device concealed in plain sight. Stauffenberg carried it along the gravel path that led to the briefing hut. Every step measured, every breath a negotiation with anxiety. He had rehearsed this path countless times, but rehearsals could not simulate the weight of history pressing on him now. The SS allowed him to pass without suspicion, a momentary lapse in vigilance that history would call fortune. Then came the critical, unpredictable twist. Hitler, feeling the summer heat, ordered the meeting to move from the heavy, reinforced bunker to a temporary wooden hut, a structure built to hold maps, staff officers, and field reports. The conspirators had planned for a confined bunker, where even a modest bomb could have ended the Führer's life. Instead, the thin walls of a wooden hut, combined with a massive oak table and scattered map boards, would become, inadvertently, Hitler's shield. Stauffenberg stepped into the room. Officers and generals moved past him, unaware. He placed the briefcase beneath the table, strategically positioning it as close to Hitler as he could without drawing attention. The pencil detonator clicked into life with a muted mechanical precision. Every movement seemed to stretch time, every breath a gamble. Then, excusing himself as if part of the routine, he exited the hut, sprinting toward his waiting car. The explosion came exactly as planned, yet completely unpredictable in consequence. A blinding flash engulfed the hut. Wood splintered, concrete shattered, and a concussive shockwave hurled officers and papers alike into the air. Flames licked at the edges of the room. Men screamed. Some were thrown across the floor, broken and bleeding. The oak table, massive and unyielding, absorbed much of the blast. Map boards shielded others. By chance, by fortune, Hitler emerged alive, largely unscathed, crouched beneath the table, bloodied but breathing. Outside, Stauffenberg was already in motion, unaware that his target had survived. His driver urged the car forward, the motor roaring as they tore back toward the airstrip. The morning sun caught on the polished fuselage of his aircraft, a symbol of urgency and hope. In Berlin, the rest of the conspirators awaited the signal, the confirmation that the Führer was dead. Each minute without word intensified the tension, the weight of what had been attempted, and the stakes for every officer in the resistance. Inside the Wolfschanz, chaos reigned. Officers scrambled. The SS sealed exits, and Hitler, dazed but alive, began issuing new orders with his characteristic focus. The very walls of the wooden hut seemed to mock the conspirators' plan. Every piece of furniture, every beam of wood, every scattered map had conspired against them as much as the bullets, bombs, or fate could have. Stauffenberg, high above the forests on the return flight to Berlin, believed the impossible had been achieved. Hitler was dead. The path to seize the government, to complete the coup, lay before him. He had set history in motion, and yet, unknown to him, it had not gone as intended. The next hours would determine not only the fate of the conspirators but the destiny of a nation teetering on the edge of annihilation. In those 10 seconds, the flash, the shrapnel, the crash of oak and glass, the world had paused. The Wolf's Lair had erupted in fire, and a single officer, scarred and resolute, carried with him the belief that Germany might finally be saved from itself. The countdown to history had begun. By the afternoon of July 20, 1944, Operation Valkyrie, the reserve army plan repurposed into a tool for Germany's salvation, was set in motion. From the Bendler Block, the nerve center of the resistance in Berlin, officers scrambled to activate reserve units across the Reich. Orders were sent to mobilize regiments, seize key communications hubs, and secure government buildings. Every phone line hummed with tension, every teleprinter clacked with urgency. Yet within minutes, cracks appeared. Confusion spread like wildfire. Some commanders hesitated, unwilling to act without definitive proof of Hitler's death. Others received conflicting messages. Telephones rang incessantly, but answers came too slowly, too inconsistently. The carefully rehearsed chain of command became tangled in chaos. Berlin, the heart of the coup, was paralyzed by uncertainty. Albrecht, Beck, and Stauffenberg worked frantically, coordinating movements, issuing orders, and sending couriers through the streets. Each step was measured, each decision a gamble. Soldiers in the reserve army waited in barracks, rifles in hand, their loyalty torn between the oath to Hitler and the promises of a new Germany. Across the city, minor successes flickered, bridges secured, radio stations occupied, but the momentum was fragile, dependent entirely on a single variable: Hitler. Then came the call that shattered hope. Through a crackling line, confirmation arrived. Hitler had survived the blast at the Wolfschanz. His voice, calm yet commanding, radiated authority. Within minutes, Joseph Goebbels alerted loyalist elements throughout Berlin. The SS mobilized. Armored units moved through the streets, checkpoints were reinforced, and barricades erected at every strategic junction. The carefully orchestrated plan unraveled as swiftly as it had been conceived. What had begun as a meticulously timed coup turned into frantic improvisation. Orders were rescinded, reserves stood down, and panic replaced purpose. Messages between Albrecht, Beck, and Stauffenberg became desperate phone calls, their tone raw with fear and disbelief. Every second brought the reality closer. The city, and with it the country, was slipping from their control. By evening, the dream of saving Germany, of ending the dictatorship before further destruction, had crumbled. Arrests began. Barricades closed around the Bendler Block. Officers who had believed they were shaping history now faced the inexorable machinery of the Reich, loyal to a Führer who had cheated death. The streets of Berlin, moments ago poised for revolution, now bristled with loyalists. And in the heart of the Bendler block, men who had carried the hopes of a nation realized that the window for redemption had slammed shut, and the consequences would be absolute. The night of July 20th, 1944, settled over the Bendler block with a chilling finality. The echoes of telephones, hurried footsteps, and desperate shouts had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Within the walls of the military headquarters, the conspirators faced the stark truth. Their plan had failed, and the machinery of the Reich had closed around them. Klaus von Stauffenberg, Colonel Albrecht Merz von Kornheim, General Friedrich Albrecht, and Ludwig Beck were corralled into a small courtyard, flanked by guards who had once been allies. Arguments flared briefly. Questions of who had failed, who had delayed orders, who bore responsibility. But there was no time for blame. The Reich demanded retribution. Beck, the former chief of the general staff and the moral compass of the plot, quietly requested a pistol. He understood that the only control left was over his own death. At exactly 0:30, the executions began. The soldiers moved with mechanical efficiency, rifles leveled, eyes straight ahead. Stauffenberg, his right hand bandaged, had already accepted the inevitability of his fate. As he stood on the courtyard steps, he raised his voice once, steady and resolute. Es lebe das heilige Deutschland. Long live sacred Germany. A volley rang out. Men who had planned to save a nation fell silent in an instant. Their deaths were swift, but the consequences rippled outward. Within hours, the Gestapo descended on Berlin and beyond. Thousands were arrested, many tortured for information. Around 200 men and women connected to the conspiracy would be executed in the weeks that followed. At Plötzensee prison, victims were hanged with piano wire, their bodies swinging as warnings to all who might dream of dissent. Hitler's fury extended beyond the immediate conspirators. The Wehrmacht, already fractured by battlefield defeats and internal distrust, was purged on an unprecedented scale. Loyalists within the SS expanded their power, seizing command over military districts and intelligence networks. Entire units were scrutinized for loyalty, officers removed or reassigned, and any sign of hesitation treated as treason. The regime, bloodied but intact, tightened its grip on a nation teetering on collapse. In the cold hours of that July night, the Bendler block stood empty of its conspirators, yet heavy with the memory of courage, resolve, and moral defiance. The streets of Berlin, dark and tense, bore witness to the swift suppression of hope. And yet, history never forgets its questions. Beneath the shadows of execution, a quieter, haunting thought remained. A question the world would carry for decades. What if they had succeeded? History often measures courage by success, but the story of the July 20th plot is a reminder that bravery is not always rewarded with victory. Scholars and military historians have long debated what might have followed had Klaus von Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators succeeded. The scenario they envisioned was perilous, complex, and far from guaranteed. Yet, for a fleeting moment, it was within reach. Had the assassination worked, Operation Valkyrie would have placed the reserve army in control of key communications, government buildings, and military districts across Germany. Generals and officers loyal to the conspirators could have mobilized quickly to seize power. The immediate goal would have been to negotiate a ceasefire with the Western Allies, presenting a government capable of ending the war in the West without further destruction of German cities. Some historians argue that such a move might have spared hundreds of thousands of civilian lives lost in the final months of Allied bombing campaigns. Yet the path forward was not straightforward. Hitler's survival had already revealed the fractured loyalties within the military. Even if he had died, a civil confrontation between the Wehrmacht and the SS was likely inevitable. The SS, fiercely loyal to National Socialist ideology and under the command of Heinrich Himmler, would not have surrendered power quietly. Urban centers, transport hubs, and communication lines could have become battlegrounds within Germany itself, prolonging bloodshed even as the war's outcome hung in the balance. One undeniable consequence of a successful coup would have been the potential to halt parts of the Holocaust months earlier. Deportations and mass killings, particularly in territories occupied by the Wehrmacht, could have been slowed or stopped if a new leadership had moved decisively to dismantle SS structures. Yet, even with such intervention, the Soviet advance from the east was relentless. Moscow, Leningrad, and the Ukrainian front could not have been halted. German forces were already exhausted, depleted, and strategically cornered. Any new government would have faced the unyielding reality of military defeat. Still, the legacy of July 20th is measured not in unrealized victories, but in courage. The conspirators, Stauffenberg, Tresckow, Beck, Albrecht, and countless others, acted knowing the consequences were almost certain death. They did not succeed in stopping Hitler, but they demonstrated that inside a state built on fear and obedience, conscience still survived. Today, monuments in Berlin, plaques in Plötzensee prison, and historical scholarship honor them not for triumph, but for the audacity to resist. In a regime where compliance meant survival, they chose moral responsibility over self-preservation. Their names endure as a reminder that resistance is possible even under tyranny, a spark of humanity that cannot be erased by failure. 10 seconds could not stop the war, but they proved that even inside Hitler's Germany, courage still lived.